Excellent. And so, firstly, we've had a really wonderful talk from Neil to start the day. And it's really fascinating for me because Neil and I sort of touch on many of the same topics, but sometimes from quite different angles. And so I'm really looking forward to sharing something that is both similar and quite different. And so thank you, Megan. As you've heard, my name's Andrew Cusworth. I'm an 1851 research fellow at the Bodleian Libraries. And as you've probably guessed from the title of my talk, Recoding the Past, Digital Remediation, the Remodeling of History, my interests center around how archives shift into the digital environment, the processes behind that shift, and how that affects our interactions with the archive, and ultimately what it means for the histories that the archive allows us to tell. Despite the rather copious title of the talk, I'm going to be addressing things that I think are fairly fundamental to digital archival culture, to the culture of archives more generally. And I'm hoping that you'll enjoy the thoughts that I've got to share with you today. It won't necessarily be the most practical of talks, but I'm hoping that it will be thought-provoking nonetheless. And so I'd like to begin by considering what an archive actually is. I'd like to echo Megan to begin with from yesterday and ask you to grab your arms of pencil and paper and jot down an answer or cloud of thoughts or just a list of things that you think of in response to the question, what is an archive? In a Foucauldian view, the archive is everything. It's the law and the foundation upon which the law is built. And this is a sort of thing that crops up regularly in conversations about archives and frustrates people in the archival profession to some extent. But I'm still inclined to that view for various philosophical reasons, which will probably become clear as the talk goes on. However, to be less dramatic and Foucauldian, and probably for most purposes and for today's purposes, an archive for me is a combination of two things. It's a repository of material traces of cultural activity, and it's also the system through which those traces are accessed. Archives are driven, I feel, by the desire to create an organized record of the activities of the past, or indeed the present, so that the future can better understand how the future came to be. We might simply call it the urge to save things for posterity, or the desire to collect stuff. But the work of the archivist always reminds me, to a greater or lesser extent, of that of Walter Benjamin's Angel of History. In his very last writings, Benjamin characterized a dialectical tension in history, using the image of an angel suspended between the past and the present. It's quite a short passage, and so I'll read all of it. There is a picture by Clay called Angelus Novus. It shows an angel who seems about to move away from everything he stares at. His eyes are wide, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. This is how the angel of history must look. His face is turned up towards the past, where a chain of events appears before us. He sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage, and hurls it at his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise and has got caught in his wings. It's so strong that the angel can no longer close them. This storm drives him irresistibly into the future, to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows towards the sky. What we call progress is this storm. And so, suspended on the wings of change, the angel tries to piece together the past. I imagine it carefully attempting to sort through the debris and discovering that however close it comes to having laid out the evidence for something, the thing itself can never actually be restored. And all that can be gained from it is an impression. And this is an activity that reminds me always of many historians and archivists that I know. In Benjamin's image, the angel is caught between two things: the preservation of the past and the translation of the past for the future. What's the point in keeping the past if it's meaningless to the future? Similarly, archives always reflect at least two contexts: the context in which the traces of life that they contain were created, and the context in which they're currently accessed and understood, but also a third context, the context in which the archives themselves were constructed. The context in which they're currently understood is always continuously negotiated and is a process rather than an absolute fact. And so what do we expect of an archive? In order for it to fulfill its role in our current context, whatever it be, we have a number of expectations, and not all archives fulfill all of them, and I suspect that very few fulfill any of them or all of them completely. We expect initially for there to be a body of material. We expect that the material is organized and catalogued in some way. And we expect to be able to access the material through processes of searching, requesting, and delivery. We expect to be able to interact with material. And increasingly, we expect one or more of these processes to be carried out digitally. And so to refer back to the title of what would have been a course on this summer school, when archives become digital, there is the question of when an archive actually is classed as a digital archive. And so there's a question about whether it's a requirement for all of those expectations that we've just talked about to be met before an archive is in fact a digital archive. When thinking of archives of non-digital materials, at least, it's very rare to find complete archives that have been made fully digital. Rather, we tend to be confronted by a sort of Frankensteinian monster of bits and pieces. A digital catalogue and request system that is paired with a physical system of delivery, requesting something online and visiting an archive to view it. Or more bizarrely still, and as I have experienced, a paper request system paired with a document being brought to you as a photograph on an iPad. And so what we encounter more often than not, particularly with non-digital archives or physical original object archives, is a sort of cyborg hybridized archive. So that rather than seeing archives as a binary non-digital or digital thing, it's easier to think of them in terms of a very messy and entangled spectrum of digitalization. And it might look a little bit like this. You'll notice that I've played various games with square brackets, which I rather enjoy doing, to create a sort of hybrid word from digitized and digitalized. And I've done this because I'm interested in the process of digitization and digitalization as two separate things. And I like to distinguish between them. And this partly comes from having previously worked as a digitization technician, but also from a genuine interest in how the digitalization of archival systems affects how we understand knowledge. And so digitization, I regard as the creation of digital representations of physical objects. And so the capturing of something in digitized form or in digital form of something that was originally not digital. And digitalization, I regard as the entire sweep of and suite of systems that goes into creating a digital archive. And so it is the system of objects and the way in which we find and interact with them, all made digital. The spectrum here begins with a non-digital object. For example, a manuscript. And the first step towards its existence in the digital world might be that it is mentioned in a paper that appears online or in a digital format. and that is its sort of first referencing. Next, it might appear in a digital index of the archive, such as a database. And that might simply be in the form of a shelf mark and an index number. To take a step further along, it's described fully, and that might take the form of a proper catalogue record with a detailed description of the object, of the manuscript. Next, it might be digitized, and so the manuscript has been captured in some way, whether by image or by transcription. But still, at this point, it's not accessible particularly to the outside world. It might be sitting on a flash drive or a hard disk somewhere, and not accessible to people in general. The next stage I think of as a more integrated system. And so the digital object, looking backwards through referencing and index and description, is integrated into a system of objects. There's a digital delivery, and there are references to digital materials that mean you can access the object either online or through a computer. And I suppose the ultimate stage of this digitalization process would be for the digital representation of the manuscript, the digital copy, to be mentioned or linked to from another online source, such as an academic paper or a blog post, rather than referencing back to the non-digital version, which is still something of a significant problem in academia. That there's a sense in which some academics still choose to valorize the original document above the digital document with which they might actually be working. And so they reference the non-digital rather than digital and create this kind of hidden world of digital citation or lack of digital citation. This spectrum, of course, is a long way from perfect. It's something of a work in progress, and it's quite possible for these stages to come in differing orders. Something might be digitized a long time before it's catalogued properly or described online. But I hope it captures some of my thinking about those stages through which physical archival materials become part of a digital archive. And I'd probably just like to spend a couple of moments referring back to some of Neil's talk, looking at the ways in which these things are stored and created. And so you might recognize some of the acronyms and things from Neil's talk. And so EAD and MARC and RDF and SQL as means of storing information. And I know that I've used those to describe both the indexing and the description. And that is in a sense to do with the depth of description. One is saying that we know that this is here. The other is saying this is what it is and what it's about. Digitization is a very broad range of things, or can be a very broad range of things, depending on the type of document, the original. And can range from everything from transcription in TEI to photography, standard photography, to multispectral photography, where a wider range of light is captured, or the light spectrum is captured than the human eye can perceive, and is compressed into perceptible things, or it could indeed involve 3D scanning and modeling and things like that. And so that's a whole spectrum of things in and of itself. We tend to think about this process of digitalisation in particular, and indeed the digital shift in culture, as a process of revolution, in the same way we think of the print revolution. And here we have a sort of similar image for the print revolution. I've sort of created a sort of slightly hashed version of these texts of what that might look like. And so you start with a manuscript culture that's referenced and indexed, edited, printed, published, and then there's a muddle of those things that can occur. And in both manuscript and print cultures, as well as digital cultures, we see huge cycles of replication, of copying manuscript to manuscript, manuscript to print, print to print, prints of manuscripts. And the similarity between these two shifts in culture, in medium, makes me think that this is, and indeed the digital shift, is more than revolution, it is evolution of existing processes. It is a continuity of human culture, of copying and revising things. Yes, it might be a dramatic evolution, but the patterning of it is on existing processes. It's an addition to them. We haven't ever really left the manuscript culture, and we've certainly not left the print culture, but we have adopted digital culture on top of that. And so, as you might have guessed, where I'm going with this is the idea of mediation and the process of remediation of the archive. As well as indicating the transference from one medium to another, remediation also implies an intermediary in that process, a set of agents or an agent that acts to change how we view something, whether actively through selection or addition, or passively through the change of the medium itself. It implies that we see the original object through something else. And in the context of the archive, what we have is a new system in place to negotiate. I see this process of remediation in terms of Stuart Hall's theory of encoding decoding. For those of you who are not familiar with Stuart Hall's work, he was a cultural theorist who worked very particularly on television, which was then the pervading medium. And in the 1970s, he coined this theory of encoding decoding. And the theory suggests that on one side, there's a process of encoding. Information is encoded to be transmitted. For example, a news item read to camera is captured using the camera and is then transmitted out for viewing by an audience. And the encoding involves having an intended impact, an intended means, an intended reading of what is said. However, once it has been transmitted, it arrives with an audience who have equipment to decode the signal, but also decode those meanings potentially differently to the original meaning. And so it arrives in a new context, at a different time perhaps, or in a different place, and is viewed by a different audience who have different understandings of what is being said. And that contextual change of all of those things that happen in the intermediary means that it might be interpreted in different ways. Yes, the original message may arrive intact, but it may also be contradicted by the audience watching. It might be diverted or subverted. And aside from the obvious linguistic fun of it being called encoding and decoding, seen in the 21st century, in a digital context, this really becomes a never-ending process. And so from my grain of sand to knowledge, I like the term recoding. This idea that digital systems constantly throw up new versions of materials in different formats, seen in different places and in different ways, and that we access them constantly in new contexts. And the whole process then becomes rather more infinite than the encoding, decoding of, say, a television news report. And to convey a sense of that fractal remediation, recoding, I feel, provides that sense of openness and ongoingness, and also a recognition of the fact that what is often happening is that what we are looking at is being remade on the fly by a computer. And so how does this operate in the context of the archive? Well, we have these four categories, and I should specify that Stuart Hall actually has a slightly more extensive range of categories. This is slightly simplified to suit my interests, perhaps. And this idea of transformation is very strongly paralleled by digitization, the churning of one object into another kind of object. Transmission really is in the processes of finding and retrieval. And so the searching for something and the means by which it is found and delivered to us, the audience. Recontextualization is perhaps the single biggest change, particularly as the 21st century advances, in that now we can access almost everything, almost anywhere. And reinterpretation then, either because of the transformations that have occurred or because of differences in how something is transmitted to us or recontextualized, is the probable result of all of this. And so that's that model as we see it for an object that has been made digital, a digitized object. But what about born digital data? We should talk about born digital data. Born digital data, as I'm sure you are aware, refers to data that begins its life in a digital format. Emails, text messages, the tweets and other social media posts about what a wonderful time you're having listening to this incredibly thought-provoking paper, and the photograph you post with them of yourself reaching for the vodka. All of these are born digital objects, and they're served fully through digitalized systems of transmission. They don't exist without them. However, born digital data can have a more complicated life story. For example, most novels are born digital, as authors create their manuscripts on their laptops. But they are often remediated to print, and then they're signed. And we go back to manuscripts. And then we respond to those novels in digital formats, writing our reviews on Goodreads, or we might make a note of it in our diary. The story of things, therefore, that are born digital is not always a wholly digital story. But how does all of this fit with the notion of remediation, with these various spectra of digital integration that I've posited? Surely born digital media are already fully integrated into that. As I suggested with the idea of recoding, born digital media are almost infinitely mutable, changeable, reproducible. The way that a tweet is displayed today could be entirely different from how it appears tomorrow if the website is redesigned or the app changes, or indeed if your phone goes onto night mode. And it's certain that the context of it will change as it drops further and further down the timeline, as new tweets are added above it, as the context in which we view it changes. But more subtly, the process of transmission from the back-end author view of the tweet, the intended message, to the front-end reader view and what is received, already it's changed. Already there's a change in mediation. Already there's a recoding. But then more significantly, in terms of archives, there's the question of archive and preservation. How is that tweet stored? How is it accessed? Is it stored? Is it accessed? How do we search for it using Twitter's data access points? How does it display in the context of those searches? How do we interpret it based on the fact that if we are arriving at that tweet through one of those searches, we're probably not searching actually for that tweet, we're searching for something about it. We are already applying our own interests and contexts to reading it. And already the processes of encoding, decoding, of recoding are at play in dealing just with an archived tweet. And similarly, if we look more widely and use the Internet Archive, and if you haven't used it, it's a really fascinating and exciting thing, and I strongly recommend it. If we use the Internet Archive to explore the changes to a website in time, for example, we don't view the website as it was, we don't go to the website, but we view what has been captured at a particular moment, as it is presented to us through the lens of that archive. And so perhaps what we are seeing looks something like this. This, I hope, is very new, and so this is a thought that I had at about 5 o'clock this morning. And so please don't take the words that I've added along the bottom too seriously. I haven't had a great deal of time to think about them. But I think this idea of there being an archivalization spectrum is quite an interesting one. And I think it raises the idea that the shifting of materials into an archive, whether digital or not, implies a set of processes that are themselves a remediation, and themselves an act of recoding. And so, stepping back from that really quite dense thought, I'd like to return to the idea of archival systems and the evolution rather than revolution that takes place between non-digital and digital archives. And I think, for me, my way of understanding this and thinking about it is to think of archival machines. To turn anecdotal, I became interested in digital humanities and digital archives about 8 years ago when I was doing my PhD. And I attended the summer school myself in 2012, wholly uninitiated into the field. And what was interesting to me at that point was the potential of digital methods to understand the performance and reception history of Welsh traditional music. As I progressed through my PhD, what I became interested in were meeting points between collective and cultural memory, cultural geographies, national identity, history, culture, studies, and how all of these things intersected with the archive. And how these things related especially to performance and reception history, and to the narrativization of culture. And more, the question of what happens to cultural artifacts when they are made digital. And the point about performance and reception history is especially relevant to the study of archive, because in a sense, an archive is a capturing of performative life in the past. And so I became interested in what I like to think of as archival machines. And these are the mechanical and social processes that make archives operate. The system of documents, the collection of them, the people involved in that. The cataloging of that, the decisions made, what do we keep, how do we describe it? The storage and retrieval, whether that is digital or otherwise. Storage and retrieval, it could be a van driving down the road to pick something up. It could be handing a slip to someone and then bringing it forward to you. And the parallels that exist between this traditional archive with its reading rooms where we receive information and its digital counterpart, and the extent to which these things are actually quite interdependent, and our views and understandings of them are quite interdependent now. Whilst I was working on these things, I encountered a television series by Stephen Polyakov called Shooting the Past. And it chronicles the probable dissolution of a British photographic archive into assets after it's been bought by a large corporation. It's showing its age a little, but it pits an archivist, Oswald, who in that picture is on the left, who's an eccentric, richly knowledgeable archivist, and he's very committed to the preservation of his archive, against a modern, slick business that is represented by a laptop and a man with a database. In one scene, Oswald performs a search, and it's a physical search in space, for an aerial photograph of a particular place, a particular house, which is the childhood home of one of the business executives. He's trying to impress him. In a sequence that prefigures Google Maps and Street View by quite some time, the images shift to street level. Oswald goes and finds a photograph of a road, an intersection, a house, a porch. Later in the series, Oswald makes a failed attempt at suicide and leaves himself brain damaged. The archive itself is preserved, but the means of working through it, the means of understanding it, are broken. Oswald was the catalogue of the archive. And so the archive becomes inaccessible because of his human frailty. In considering this and as expression of the traditional archive in opposition to the modern world, paradoxically, I actually began to see relationships between the digital archive and the traditional archive that are both poetic and practical. And looked at from a particular position, they're also machinic and mechanical. Each type of archive is, as we know, a system of knowledge that is dependent on ordering, navigation, interpretation to make sense. In Oswald, the character from Shooting the Past, there was a human means, a man who performed quite literally what we now think of as the role of the computer in searching, retrieval, and delivery. In the digital context, this human interface with the knowledge system of the archive is completely replaced. It's digitalized. In the data structures and systems that we apply to archives and cultural heritage, there's an almost underlying aim to create a kind of digital archivist, a digital Oswald. And that is something in which I'm deeply interested, the preservation of knowledge, of that kind of intimate understanding of archives through digital means. But let's think a little further. Oswald was a human. He was biased. He had particular interests. He knew particular things. He had a particular view of the world that was informed by his environment. He produced particular results for particular reasons. And one can even suggest that his finding the childhood home as requested of the executive was manipulative. He deliberately found powerful stories and connections in the archive to influence others. He went beyond the archive and became the historian. And in the end, his knowledge, with its value and replicable value, was lost because of his own frailty. I see all of these processes at play in the digital mirror of the archive. Digital archives, like their traditional counterparts, store and access particular information through particular systems for particular reasons, informed by their particular environment. Items are chosen for inclusion in the archives for particular purposes, and they're described in particular ways. And that changes how people are able to find and access them, and what those people are then able to argue based on the digital archive. And in a sense, it can be even stronger than, say, visiting an archive. Looking something up through a digital archive and having it delivered to you with the branding of a particular archive or the restrictions involved in viewing something in digital space can in fact be more pervasive. The actual strength of the archival institution can be more pervasive than it can be sometimes even sitting in a reading room. And soberingly, for all of our belief in digitization and in digitalization, that it provides a sort of nirvana solution to the threat of losing materials, this idea, and of things becoming inaccessible. Much like the archival knowledge of Oswald the archivist, the digital systems that help us to operate and navigate particular materials, and the materials themselves, are all too fragile and prone to loss, either by failing to be interoperable, failing to gather the required number of users for a particular standard, mechanical failure. All of these things are a threat. And so seen in this way, the new digital archive and its machine actually begins to look very much more similar to the traditional one. And I suppose there's a kind of question. Why does all of this matter? In many senses, all archival and cultural heritage materials are the performative and receptive traces of life and lived experience. By their nature, archival and cultural heritage materials encapsulate blurry and dynamic relationships between performance and reception, the tensive relationship between presence and absence. They're the fragmentary echoes of life and presence made anew by the very absence of their creators. They are the angel of history attempting to put things together and finding that there is a gap. And in many senses, the archives that we digitalize are themselves recodings of human life and experience, recodings that we extend and we complicate, and perhaps most importantly, continue to explore and understand through processes of digitalization. At the beginning, I said I took a Foucaultian view of the archive. In his essay, The Historical A Priori and the Archive, Foucault wrote that the archive is the first law of what can be said and the system that governs statements as unique events. When we create an archive, we create a system of knowledge, and we create a system of knowledge access, and we assign to it a cultural value, a kind of cultural capital. And to understand how that operates is a privilege that requires study and perseverance, and to be able to do so well and to negotiate it well and to work with it well also lends us authority. But like every structure, archives are products of their context. They're influenced by conscious aims and unconscious biases. To return to Stuart Hall, they encode expected uses and readings. And though contrarian readings are entirely possible, what is present and what is absent from our means of negotiating, navigating, exploring the archive, will have a direct impact on how particular topics are perceived, how the materials are perceived, what we are able to say. When we remediate the archive and make it digital, when we recreate archives that are digital in and of themselves, we encode our expectations, and these expectations are decoded and re-encoded by their users. And so we do this. The work we do in this, whether in digitalizing the archive, or creating a new digital one, or decoding one to create historical narrative, is work that comes with significant responsibility. This is a time of significant and wholly justified discontent over the representation of what are supposedly minor narratives, over state and institutional oppression of minority groups whose voices should be heard as equal. The thinking behind such things as what we should digitize, how we digitize it, how we make it searchable, how we make it accessible, are important in redressing these balances. What biases do we see in the archive? What biases do we accidentally miss? Do we reiterate them in digital form? Do we make them worse, or do we make them better? Do we make things more accessible, or do we reinforce economic divides? Writing in the 1960s, the philosopher Paul Ricoeur wrote insightfully that in the age of the database, power is passed from the narrative to the datum, changing the entire way that history, that heritage can be understood, and implying a reduction of real life, the intimate history of life and experience, to real facts, to cold data. The archive, the whole messy, incomplete archive of Foucault, and indeed of every small and minuscule archive, with all of its infinite lacunae and complexity, is to some extent an antidote to this. It's a means of restoring humanity to the database that drives it. How the archive operates in digital space, how we shape it, how we interrogate it, and how we make it speak as historians, all matter quite a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That was fantastic, and real counterpoint to our talk from Neil as well. We've got two sides of very similar issues. We've got a lot of thoughts coming through on the chat, less than questions, and I think probably, you know, some real discussions can take off over on Canvas, which I feel I'm plugging like I've got something to sell. They are not sponsoring me, and we just really want you to be able to discuss things further. We've got a couple of questions though coming up, if I can find them amongst all the all the
There's
comments.
a lot.
Yeah. We've got one here. Is an archive a limited canvas to look at born digital material or practices? See, I got the word canvas in there again. Is an archive a limited canvas to look at the born digital materials or practices? Would repertoire do justice to the constant mutability? That's from Arjun.
That's quite a question, isn't it? Yes, I quite like the concept of repertoire in that also implies something that is shifting. And so I suppose there's a tension, isn't there, between looking at what exists and what is in current use, which is the repertoire and the accepted canon of the moment, with the archive, which is where things are stored, hopefully for the future. And so that's the distinction I would draw there. And it's quite an interesting question to decide where those two things, where to draw the line in those things with born digital materials. And so because born digital materials are by nature relatively recent, perhaps there's an argument to say that they're repertoire, but we can't access all of them already. Already some are basically lost. Already either, you know, something is obsolete because we don't have a floppy disk drive to plug it into, or although I do know that you do, Megan. And so,
I do. I've been clearing my house, and I have found my undergraduate dissertation on a floppy disk drive, so completely inaccessible now. Probably good thing that is there. But we have another question here on materiality in digitalization. What happens to the essentially human experiences of touch, smell, weight, physical effort, and the sound of turning pages and that place of access. I'm thinking here of the library smell is gives me my superpowers, I think, if I had any. That's from John. So what about that materiality aspect?
It reminds me of a paper I once read that celebrated dust in the archive. And I was very sad that I didn't get to quote it in my PhD. So capturing digital things, digitizing, you are making decisions about what you are going to capture. And so in theory, you could capture the sound of turning a book, or you could, capturing weight might be a bit harder, but you could capture aspects of physicality. You capture particular signals and particular structures. Inevitably, things are lost, but there are also gains to be made. And so you have to make a sort of informed decision about what you're going to choose to lose in your digitization process.
Interestingly, some of the things I've seen from the Bodleian popping up throughout the lockdown in the UK was some Bodleian soundscapes appearing online, and also library smellscapes, as in with scented candles, which is brilliant. And that question there, John, always reminds me of efforts in terms of digitization or digitalization of objects which have calls for repatriation. And sometimes people saying, oh, well, digitization will be great because the source communities can have the digital copy. And part of me thinks, in a quite a devil's advocate way, if the digital copy is just as good, then perhaps the institution with the object keeps the digital, and the materiality, the material object, returns to a source community. And I think we've just got a few more coming up. Everyone just excited to see your slides as well, Andrew. And we've got something from Sabine here about where the link between archive and censorship is in the light of this power question that you really kind of, that's very much a question of now, but of always. Where does that fit in?
I was thinking about this in relation to born digital materials in particular, though it does apply to kind of physical materials. Obviously, there are state actors and but also private actors involved with censoring information. This relates a little bit to the question about things being re-edited and deleted at whim, this kind of self-censorship. The power question is an incredibly difficult one. I mean, there are situations in which it's impossible to overcome it. You hope that the archive will in some way reflect what has been deleted, and in a sense, this is a little bit like that sort of angel of history thing of there being things missing, of not being able to completely reconstruct the past. And in a sense, our ability to find those gaps is a really important thing. And so knowing that they're there and knowing that we need to look for those gaps in censorship might actually tell us what went into them to some extent. And so this, in a way, sort of ties back to some of the presentations yesterday, talking about looking for what words might fit somewhere. What's been redacted? Why has it been redacted? How do we find these gaps? It's not an easy question at all. But in a sense, power is always challenged by evidence. Always either upheld or challenged by evidence.
And I think both talks so far this morning, we've obviously got one more to come, have really shown the importance of criticality in understanding your tools and your approach. You know, they've both really emphasised that in very different ways. There's lots more questions, so Andrew, I invite you to have a look through the chat and also to look on Canvas. There, I said it again. News for everyone who asked questions of Neil. He has been responding to those on Canvas.
Fantastic.
And we've got another 15-minute break here.
Just before the break, Megan, may I just say, if anybody has any questions they want to raise in the afternoon session, they're welcome to do that, as that will be quite a sort of discursive session, as opposed to a didactic one.
So we'll join everybody back here at 12 o'clock. That's in 15 minutes. And once again, thank you, Andrew.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
There you go.